When the most powerful ruler in the galaxy stepped down from her throne, no one dared to breathe because she was walking toward me. Before hundreds of nobles, war generals, and envoys who commanded entire star systems, the Empress descended each step in absolute silence. And then she did the impossible. She did not return to her throne. She sat beside me. No one spoke, but that silence was louder than 1,000 declarations of war. The first thing I understood about the imperial court was that silence could be weaponized. It hung from the vaulted ceiling like an invisible chandelier, heavy and glittering with expectation. Hundreds of eyes followed me as I stood alone on the polished floor at the center of the hall. The floor itself was translucent, and beneath it slow currents of light drifted like captive galaxies, rearranging themselves in patient spirals. I tried not to look down too often. There is something profoundly unsettling about realizing you are technically standing on a map of the Empire, especially when you are not entirely sure the Empire likes you. No one had told me where to put my hands. At my side seemed too defensive. Behind my back felt arrogant. Folded across my chest would probably be interpreted as a declaration of war. I settled for clasping them loosely in front of me and hoped that, somewhere in the archives, there was a cultural note reading. The human gesture of mild panic is considered respectful. The nobles were arranged in ascending tiers, their pale faces serene, their long ears tapering elegantly past strands of blonde hair that shimmered under the hall's living light. They looked almost human, which somehow made the differences more pronounced. Their ears carried filaments of silver circuitry woven through delicate jewelry. Faint pulses of information traveled along them like whispers made visible. I had the uncomfortable suspicion they were sharing private commentary about me in real time. If so, I hoped at least one of them was rating my posture kindly. At the top of the chamber, elevated upon a crescent platform carved from something that resembled moonstone but hummed faintly with power, sat the Empress. I had seen her only in transmissions before, carefully edited addresses broadcast across half the galaxy. In person, she was at once more ordinary and far more terrifying. Fair skin, blonde hair flowing over her shoulders in a way that would have made any terrestrial monarch envious. And those long ears, adorned with rings of living metal that glowed softly, as if they were listening not just to the room, but to distant stars. She regarded me with an expression that was not unkind. It was simply unreadable, which is much worse. The master of protocol announced my name in a voice amplified by invisible fields. It echoed through the hall and returned to me slightly altered, as if the building itself were considering it and finding it insufficient. I bowed. I had practiced the angle. Too shallow would be disrespectful. Too deep would suggest weakness. I aimed for diplomatically adequate. When I straightened, the silence thickened. I became acutely aware that I was the only human in a chamber designed for beings who had ruled this sector of the galaxy for millennia. I was here as an observer, a symbolic gesture of renewed cooperation. Symbolic gestures, I had learned, were often placed directly between political factions like decorative explosives. One of the generals shifted. His armor, grown rather than forged, flexed with a faint organic creak. His gaze did not waver from me. I offered him what I hoped was a friendly smile. It may have resembled a grimace. I considered saying something light to break the tension. Unfortunately, I had been explicitly instructed not to speak unless addressed. Apparently, humans had a reputation for filling silences with enthusiasm. I decided to challenge that stereotype by attempting not to faint. Then the Empress rose. It was a simple motion unaccompanied by fanfare, yet the hall reacted as though gravity itself had adjusted. Conversations, silent or otherwise, ceased entirely. The generals straightened. The envoys lowered their eyes. She descended the steps of her throne slowly, not theatrically, deliberately. Each footstep met the luminous surface with a soft resonance that traveled outward in concentric waves of light beneath the floor. I felt them through my boots, subtle vibrations like the heartbeat of a patient colossus. My mind began cataloging possible offenses I might have committed, had I stood too near the center. Was I breathing in a culturally inappropriate rhythm? On Earth, I had once offended a diplomat by using the wrong spoon. Here, I suspected the wrong spoon might trigger orbital bombardment. The Empress passed the first tier of nobles. Then the second. She did not look at them. She did not look at the foreign envoys. She did not acknowledge the High Admiral, whose expression suggested he had not been consulted about whatever was happening. She walked toward me. There is a peculiar clarity that arrives when the most powerful being in a galactic empire approaches you with no visible weapon and no visible smile. Time narrows. Peripheral thoughts fall away. I briefly wondered whether it was too late to claim I had been misplaced and actually belonged in the catering division. She stopped at my side, not in front of me, not towering over me, beside me, close enough that I could sense the faint hum radiating from her, as if she carried a restrained star within her bones. The air seemed to bend subtly around her form, particles aligning in quiet deference. And then, without a word, she lowered herself into a seat that had not been there a moment before. The floor reconfigured, matter folding and rising in obedient response to her presence. A chair formed, elegant, equal in height to the one beneath the throne. She sat, next to me. The silence that followed was no longer weaponized. It was catastrophic. Across the hall, I saw a noble's composure fracture for half a second. A general's hand tightened on the hilt of his ceremonial blade. Somewhere above, a cluster of surveillance drones adjusted their formation, recalibrating history. I remained standing for precisely 3 heartbeats before realizing that remaining upright while the Empress sat might constitute treason. I sat. The newly formed seat beneath me was warm, as if it had anticipated my weight. I kept my hands carefully visible. My thoughts, unfortunately, were not so disciplined. I leaned slightly toward her, compelled by instinct or insanity. "Your Majesty," I murmured under my breath, trusting the translation fields to behave. "If this is a test, I would like to formally state that I studied very hard." Her eyes shifted to me. Up close, they were not merely blue or green or any single color. They held gradients like distant nebulae, depth layered upon depth. For a moment I wondered if she could see the small, nervous calculations racing behind my own gaze. The faintest movement touched her lips. Not quite a smile, not quite not. She said nothing, but she remained beside me. And in that impossible, echoing hall, surrounded by nobles whose entire understanding of hierarchy had just been rearranged, I understood that whatever this gesture meant, it was larger than either of us. I only hoped it came with health benefits. By the next rotation of the capital world, the galaxy had decided that I was either a strategic genius, a biological hazard, or an unusually well-dressed hostage. No one had asked me which option I preferred. I was escorted through corridors that shifted subtly as we walked, the architecture responding to imperial biometrics like a living organism, with strong opinions about interior design. The guards flanking me moved in perfect symmetry, their long ears threaded with faint pulses of light as silent data passed between them. I tried not to feel like a parcel being delivered to an uncertain destination. Word travels quickly in an empire sustained by quantum relays and gossip. By the time I entered the council chamber, the Empress was already seated, not on the high throne, but at the circular convergence table where military projections shimmered above a field of controlled gravity. There was an empty place at her side. I paused, just long enough for protocol to tremble. A senior noble cleared his throat in a way that suggested entire bloodlines had never needed to clear their throats before. The human observer will remain at the periphery. The Empress did not look at him. She merely adjusted one slender finger on the table's surface. The empty seat beside her unfolded. I considered pretending not to notice. Unfortunately, the floor beneath me disagreed and gently guided my steps forward with a subtle magnetic insistence. I arrived at her side as if choreographed by forces that had rehearsed this moment for centuries. I sat. Across the table, a holographic star map ignited, projecting contested systems in shades of blue and amber. Fleet formations hovered like luminous schools of predatory fish. The High Admiral began outlining a strategic maneuver involving 3 carrier arcs and a gravitational sling around a dying pulsar. I listened carefully, nodding as if I had ever commanded anything larger than a terrestrial shuttle. The tension in the room was not theatrical. It was surgical. Every word was measured, every pause calibrated. The Empress spoke rarely, but when she did, the projections adjusted instantly, probabilities recalculating in cascading streams of light. At one point, the Admiral gestured toward a cluster of red indicators. If the outer colonies perceive weakness, insurrection will follow. Several eyes flicked toward me. I raised a hand cautiously. For the record, I said, humans typically schedule insurrections at least a week in advance. It helps with logistics. A ripple moved through the chamber. Not laughter, never quite that, but a soft disturbance in the collective composure. One junior tactician's lips twitched before discipline reclaimed them. The Admiral regarded me as one might regard an unexpected asteroid. Your species' scheduling habits are irrelevant. Good, I replied. Because we're not very consistent. The Empress did not silence me. She allowed the moment to exist, suspended between offense and amusement. Then she shifted the star map with a precise gesture, isolating a system near the Empire's border. Historical context, she said. The table responded. Archival data cascaded into view, centuries-old transmissions, fragmented battle logs, gravitational readings from a catastrophe long stabilized. A star that had once threatened to collapse prematurely, its death spiral poised to consume half a sector. I recognized the designation. Humanity's early deep range fleet had intervened there, deploying experimental stellar stabilizers that most of our own scientists had privately described as optimistic. The chamber grew still. The Empire survived, the Empress continued, because assistance was accepted. Her long ears caught the ambient light, faint currents moving along their edges, as if the past itself were whispering through them. A noble from the inner systems leaned forward. That event was resolved. By cooperation, she replied. The words settled heavily. I cleared my throat, aware that I was suddenly adjacent to history. In our defense, I said gently, we were mostly trying to avoid being vaporized ourselves. A few glances sharpened. The junior tactician's composure wavered again. The Empress's gaze shifted to me. There was the faintest glimmer there, acknowledgement perhaps, or warning. The council resumed, but something had changed. The discussion no longer orbited abstract power. It circled precedent, obligation, memory. Outside the chamber, I could feel the Empire reacting. Encrypted channels flared with speculation. Faction leaders recalibrated alliances. My personal communicator, confiscated upon arrival, was undoubtedly overflowing with messages I was grateful not to read. When the session adjourned, the nobles departed in careful order. Conversations resumed in low frequencies, some audible, others carried along the glowing filaments threaded through elongated ears. I remained seated beside the Empress. You are aware, I murmured quietly, that I am not strategically valuable. She regarded the now dim star map. You are present. That is not the same thing. No, she agreed, it is more disruptive. I considered that. On my world, that is rarely considered a compliment. Her lips curved barely. Your world is young, and yours is patient. Her gaze shifted toward the chamber doors, where distant figures lingered in calculated proximity. My empire is accustomed to hierarchy, and sitting beside me interferes with that. Yes, I exhaled softly. I should probably apologize. For what? For existing at the wrong altitude. Her eyes returned to mine, steady and unreadable. Altitude, she said, is a matter of perspective. There was no grand declaration, no formal decree. Yet as we rose together from the convergence table, I sensed the recalculation spreading outward through fleets, through courts, through centuries of carefully curated narrative. Guards reformed around us, but their formation had shifted subtly, not enclosing, accompanying. As we exited the chamber, a young officer risked a glance at me. "Human," he said cautiously, "is this proximity permanent?" I considered the question with all the authority of someone who had not been consulted about his own fate. "I certainly hope it comes with dental coverage," I replied. He blinked, uncertain whether dental coverage was a weapon system. Beside me, the Empress allowed the smallest, unmistakable exhale of amusement. And in that fragile sound, quieter than the hum of the capital's energy core, I understood that the real disruption was not military. It was relational. And the galaxy, for all its fleets and gravity wells, had very little defense against that. The coup announcement arrived disguised as a procedural correction. It was delivered at dawn cycle through the imperial network, phrased in language so polite it nearly apologized for itself. An extraordinary convocation, a clarification of succession optics, a restoration of structural dignity, which, translated from aristocratic dialect, meant, "We are about to attempt something profoundly unwise." I was eating something that had introduced itself as fruit when the summons reached us. It rearranged its molecular sweetness depending on my pulse, which felt like an unnecessary level of intimacy for breakfast. Across from me, the Empress read the transmission without visible reaction. The light along her long ears flickered once, faint and controlled. "Is this the part where I'm discreetly relocated to a secure storage facility?" I asked. "If there were such a facility," she replied calmly, "it would already be compromised." "Comforting." She rose. I did not wait for the floor to instruct me this time. The grand hall was fuller than before. Nobles occupied every tier, their composure sharpened into something brittle. Military leaders stood in rigid alignment. Above us, the surveillance drones hovered in tighter formation, their lenses gleaming with anticipatory curiosity. At the far end of the chamber stood Lord Vaelor of the Inner Systems, whose patience with my existence had been visibly limited from the start. His blonde hair was bound severely. The circuitry along his elongated ears pulsed in disciplined patterns. "Your Majesty," he began smoothly, "the Empire endures through order. Symbols have their place, but recent gestures have introduced instability." I resisted the urge to look behind me, in case the symbol in question was taller and more qualified. Vaelor continued, "To seat a foreign species at parity, without consultation, invites doubt." Murmurs rippled outward. Not chaotic, calculated. The Empress descended the steps of her throne again. This time I did not feel surprise. I felt recognition. I had seen this geometry before. She did not sit beside me immediately. Instead, she stepped into the open center of the hall, directly beneath the highest arc of the ceiling where the Empire's emblem shimmered in suspended light. "You speak of order," she said. Her voice carried without amplification. It did not need it. "Order," she continued, "is not fragility." Vaelor inclined his head slightly. "Order requires hierarchy. It requires memory." At her gesture, the air above us fractured into holographic layers. The stellar archive bloomed into view, not as a single projection but as a living reconstruction. We stood suddenly within a simulation of that ancient crisis, the destabilizing star, its surface writhing in catastrophic flares. Gasps moved through the chamber despite centuries of distance. Human vessels appeared at the periphery, small, inelegant by imperial standards. I felt a strange flicker of pride. We had always built ships like we expected them to be hit by things. The simulation accelerated, stabilizers deployed, calculations failed, adjustments were improvised. The stars collapsed slowed by degrees that had once seemed statistically impossible. Imperial ships, then far less advanced than their modern descendants, moved in coordinated response. Not above, not below, alongside. The hall was silent except for the faint hum of archived physics. Vaelor's composure faltered. That alliance was contextual. It was survival, the Empress said. The simulation shifted again, this time to the unedited diplomatic exchange that followed the crisis. An imperial sovereign, predecessor to the Empress, extending formal acknowledgement to humanity. Words of parity, of shared risk. They were never vassals, she said quietly. We were never solitary. The projection faded. Silence settled, but it was no longer brittle. It was reflective. Vaelor straightened. Ancient gratitude does not mandate present equivalence. No, she agreed, present wisdom does. She turned then, and this time she walked to me in full view of every faction, every censor, every whispering channel. When she sat beside me, it was not disruption. It was confirmation. Something in me shifted as well. When I had first stood in this hall, I had been careful, cautious, self-deprecating to the point of invisibility. Humor as armor, presence as accident. Now, as eyes settled on us again, I felt something steadier. I rose. Protocol shuddered audibly. "May I?" I asked softly. The Empress inclined her head. I stepped forward into the center of the hall where she had stood moments before. My reflection shimmered faintly in the luminous floor beneath me, one human, undeniably smaller, undeniably mortal. "I am not here to replace anyone," I said. "I am not here to dilute your history. I am here because once our species chose not to let you burn, and you chose not to let us." A faint stir moved through the tears. "On my world," I continued, "we have a habit of surviving by accident and then pretending we planned it. But we are learning, slowly, sometimes painfully." I allowed myself a small smile, very slowly. A few expressions softened. "Hierarchy can be useful," I said, "but partnership built your empire when it mattered most. If sitting beside your Empress threatens that structure, perhaps the structure is overdue for renovation." I returned to my place beside her before my courage reconsidered its life choices. Vaelor studied us. Calculations flickered along his ears. Around him, other nobles conferred in low pulses of light. The High Admiral stepped forward unexpectedly. "The fleets will not fracture over seating arrangements," he said gruffly. "They will fracture over forgotten debts." He inclined his head, not to me but to the Empress. "The record stands." One by one, others followed. Not dramatic pledges, not theatrical bows, simply acknowledgement. Vaelor hesitated the longest. Then, with visible restraint, he inclined his head as well. "Let it be recorded," he said, "that the Empire adapts." The tension dissolved not with applause, but with recalibration. Later, as the hall emptied and the drones drifted back to their standard formations, I exhaled a breath I had been holding for several political eras. "You realize," I murmured to the Empress, "that I improvised most of that." "I am aware," she said. "That was not a strategic masterpiece." "No," she agreed, "it was honest." We sat in companionable quiet. "I used to think I was here by accident," I admitted. "You were," she said mildly. I blinked. "That is not reassuring." "Accidents," she continued, "are often intersections of unplanned truths." I considered that. "On Earth, we usually just call them mistakes." Her lips curved fully this time. A rare, unguarded expression that transformed her from untouchable sovereign to something startlingly present. "Then perhaps," she said, "the galaxy required one." As we rose together and left the hall, not ruler and symbol, but partners in a recalibrated balance, I realized that I no longer felt like a decorative explosive placed between factions. I felt like a participant, and for the first time since arriving beneath that impossible ceiling, I stood not because protocol demanded it, but because I